Ryan. I'll tell everybody from the start, if you have any questions, just go ahead and chime in. I'm a pretty informal presenter. So like Brian said, I'm Adam Murray. I'm the new state beef cattle extension specialist from New York. I'm originally from Virginia, and I grew up raising and showing beef cattle all across the country. Mainly did Angus, but had some Shorthorn, some Simmental, some crossbred, kind of you name it in there. So, like I said, mainly beef cattle, but also swine as well. So the 4-H and youth livestock and youth cattle programs are a real big part of my growing up and what ultimately led me to my career path today. So I really appreciate y'all chiming in and seeing what I have to say, and I try to give back to these organizations as much as possible. So Brian asked me to kind of give a beef cattle 101, and with my background in meat science and ruminant nutrition, I thought it'd be really easy to just talk about kind of some basic nutrition principles of beef cattle. I'll talk briefly about the industry, kind of give an overview of the beef cattle industry, how it's organized. We'll get into some digestive physiology of the ruminants and what makes cattle different from hogs and poultry and some of our other monogastric single stomach livestock. Then we'll kind of end up with some wrap up with some recommendations on for y'all raising your beef cattle or your own or 4-H projects, whatever it might be. So kind of some nutrition rules of thumb, and we'll do a brief feed tag exercise as well. So I'm kind of calling this Beef 101, but like I said, it's going to be more nutrition focused than anything. And of course, my slides aren't moving. There we go. So for those of you kind of unfamiliar with the beef industry, it's what we call horizontally integrated. So that just means that there's a lot of different sections and segments of the beef industry that kind of work independently of each other. So we're going to start in where the cattle cycle or cattle industry starts is obviously with the cow-calf producers. So their goal is to have breeding stock, and whether it's heifers or cows, they're going to have a calf every year, wean that calf, and sell that calf to the next stage of the cycle. Now, sometimes cow-calf producers will also function as feeder finishers themselves, and they can retain ownership or keep those calves on their farm and feed them out and directly market them to consumers. But a lot of the time, they'll sell these weaned calves anywhere from 6 to 8 months old, anywhere from 400 to 800 pounds weaning weight, depending on the breed and a lot of different management decisions. But they will sell these weaned calves to what we call backgrounders or stockers. So these are primarily forage-based feeding programs, and their goal is to kind of transition these weaned calves and manage them during the highly stressful period of weaning. They'll go through vaccinations with them. They'll kind of get these calves used to fermented feeds and eating grain instead of nursing off the mom and being out on pasture. A lot of the time, these programs are these backgrounding and stocker programs are forage based. So they will have these calves during the highly efficient period of early life where they can really convert feed well and grow pretty quickly. They'll have these programs as forage based, and they might supplement them with soy hulls or brewer's grains or what have you. But their goal is to really put cheap gain on cattle. So use as little feed resources as possible to feed and grow these calves as much as possible. From the backgrounding and stocker stage, they'll usually move on to a finishing program that'll be more intensively managed. So there'll be a lot more concentrates, a lot more feed, or a lot more corn and wheat and brewer's grains. These high energy feedstuffs will be kind of the primary ration. So they're going from a mainly forage-based ration in the backgrounding and stocker stage into a mainly grain and concentrate-based ration. And that's when we're preparing these animals for harvest, and we're focusing on fattening and finishing these animals as opposed to just kind of lean growth that we saw on the stage before. And it's important to point out that not every animal has to go through every stage, right? So depending on the market, depending on feed resources, depending on the type of calf, you might have a weaned calf that's maybe larger framed and pretty heavy muscle, and he might go right into a high grain finishing program. Or if you might have a smaller, more moderate frame calf, kind of needs to catch up a little bit, then maybe a backgrounding or stocker program might be the better option. So, well, I'll come back to this later, but when we're talking about nutrition and we're talking about feeding animals, it's really important to understand, set your goals early. So understand what segment of the industry you're in, and with that, what type of animal is profitable and successful, and concurrently how you need to feed those animals. So, just like I said, a brief overview of the beef industry, and each segment is going to be focused on a different nutritional goal because, each segment of the industry is going to be paid differently and going to have different premiums. So, with that, I'll ask y'all, what is a nutrient, right? We see cattle here eating out of a feed bunk. It looks like some carrots, some lettuce, some brown stuff that could be silage or haylage, some sort of root tomato or potato tuber type thing. I'll ask y'all and go ahead and unmute, what is a nutrient? There's really no wrong answer here.
Water, protein.
Yeah, so water, protein, those are different classes of nutrients. But pretty broadly, what we call a nutrient is basically any substance that provides nourishment essential for
Things that
growth
an animal
and
needs to
maintenance of
survive.
life. Say that again. Oh,
Things that an animal needs to survive.
that's exactly right. Right. This is the fuel that we put in the tank that makes sure that keeps animals not only surviving but also growing. So that's exactly right. And a couple of y'all mentioned earlier, you named some classes of nutrients as well. So we have protein, energy, vitamin, minerals. Some of you said water earlier. I'll give you all kind of another trick question. What do you think is the most important nutrient out of all these?
Water.
That's
Protein.
100%. Whoever said water, whoever said water got it first, and y'all must have seen the presentation, or you kind of knew my trick question. So water is the most important nutrient out of all, protein, energy, vitamins, minerals, from the standpoint of if you have an animal that runs out of water, you're going to be in a bad way, and that animal's going to have some problems and some issues running out of water a lot more quickly than if they run out of a protein source or an energy source, etc. So I always tell folks, and especially 4-H groups and younger folks getting into agriculture, water is the most important nutrient, and depending on where you're at and what time of year it is, you can have a lot of challenges associated with providing consistent, clean water. I have a picture here. Everyone in New York's dealt with the struggle, I imagine, of breaking ice in a water trough, but really, that's really, really necessary because water is going to drive our dry matter intake. So if you don't have enough clean, accessible water, it doesn't matter what other feed you have available, they're probably not going to eat enough. And understanding this will be kind of a theme that I talk about throughout this entire presentation. Understanding what kind of animal you have is going to really drive their water needs. So bigger animals obviously are going to need more water than smaller animals. So we see here kind of at the bottom of this chart that I have, there's a 1,500-pound cow at the bottom and a 1,100-pound cow at the top, and they can have, depending on the temperature as well, a lot different water needs. But in general, bigger animals are going to need more water, and then when it's hotter out, they're going to need a lot more water as well. So, I mean, in extreme cases, you see in the bottom right section of this chart, a 1,500-pound cow, when it's 90 degrees out, she can drink 21, 22 gallons of water a day. So she's really going to be putting it down, and whether it's hot or cold, even when it's 40 degrees out in cold, they're still going to need water. And it's really, really important to have clean water as well to make sure that those animals are utmost of health and not getting parasites, from algae or dirty, muddy water that could rob them of other nutrients and rob them of some growth. So y'all passed the test, I guess, or the trick question early on and understood that, water is really the most important nutrient. Although, again, they're all going to be important to make sure that we meet our growth and production goals. So we've talked about different types of nutrients. I want to get into a little bit of just the ruminant digestive system. And I always say that, form follows function. So when we understand how the pieces of the digestive tract fit together and how what their roles are and how really um, the whole the ruminant digestive system works. When we understand how it works, we can understand how to make it the most efficient. So I keep saying this term ruminants, and I'm sure everyone's heard, cows and sheep and goats have four stomachs, and that's a little bit of a misnomer. Really, they have one giant stomach that is separated into four different compartments, right? So whereas pigs and humans have one stomach, cattle can have one kind of ruminant stomach that's separated into four parts. And then from that, as feed is processed, it'll go back to the intestines and, through the small and large intestine, etc. But I really like this picture because it shows really just the size and scope of the ruminant digestive tract. So you can see here in the bottom kind of yellow writing, the whole digestive tract is about 20 times as long as the animal, right? So the ruminant the rumen complex has a capacity of about 50 gallons and total capacity overall of 80 gallons when you include the intestines as well. So there's really a lot going on through this tract, and I'm kind of going to go through it piece by piece. So it starts obviously with the mouth, and cattle and specifically are pretty unique from other animals in the fact that they do not have top teeth, or front top teeth, excuse me. They have bottom teeth, and they have what we call a dental pad. And this is important because when they eat, you can see from the picture of that white animal up top with the black nose, they don't really bite. When they're eating, they are wrapping their tongue around feed, and whether it's hay or grass or they're ripping actually with their tongue. So they're kind of wrapping their tongue around that feed and squeezing and ripping that grass up. Or if they're eating corn and wheat and distillers or whatever else, kind of grain, they are scooping everything up with their tongue. So right off the bat, it's really important to understand that this scooping motion is really going to drive what type of feed that they eat and they prefer. If you have really, really fine ground corn that's dusty and kind of particulate, those cattle are going to have a real hard time of eating it. And they might not, lick the corners of their feed bunk or their feed pan trying to get all the last bit of that dry powdered feed up because it's frustrating for them. And they're just going to spend more energy doing it. And it's just not the most efficient way to provide feed to animals. So, whereas we feed a lot of soybean meal to pigs and a lot of fine ground feeds to pigs, that's probably not the most efficient way to feed cattle. So we need to keep that in mind and understand, again, they're eating with their tongue and they're wrapping that tongue around. So how we deliver feed is going to do a lot of how much they eat and how efficient they are at growing. So as cattle age, their baby teeth are replaced by adult teeth, and you can actually get a pretty good guess of animals depending on the size of their teeth. We call that mouthing. And that's done in the beef industry a lot. But going back to, I guess, how important the water intake is always a fun kind of trivia fact for me. Is cattle produce 13 to 40 gallons of saliva a day. So that saliva is going to help them, moisten their feed to make it more accessible and readily digestible. It's going to aid in swallowing, and it's also going to start the digestive process. So in that saliva, we have some enzymes that start breaking down the feed as soon as cattle get it in their mouth. So right off the bat, it's important to understand that, again, the mouth starts the digestive process, and it's part of the reason why we cull a lot of older cows. So if you get a 15, 16, 17-year-old cow, sometimes she can have problems maintaining body condition because her teeth are worn down or she's lost a lot of teeth and she can't digest and break up that feed enough, and she can't process that feed and to be an efficient energy and protein source for her. So it's, mouth health is really important, and it's something that really goes overlooked a lot of the time when we're talking about nutrition in cattle. So from the mouth, we go back to the actual ruminant system and ruminant stomach, I should say, and it starts with the rumen, right? So there's four compartments of the rumen that I will go through now, and I'll have pictures of each of them. So that kind of fuzzy, furry thing on the left, that's actually the inside lining of the rumen. So I mentioned earlier, when full-grown animals, this can be 50 gallons or more. So picture your garbage can that you take out every week. That's the size of the rumen compartment or the first compartment of our ruminant digestive system. And the main purpose of the rumen is it really serves as a digestive vat or a fermented vat. So the rumen is filled with a whole bunch of bacteria and microorganisms and protozoa and fungi and all sorts of things. And that's really what's doing the digestion in cattle and in ruminants. So it's actually the same thing in sheep and goats as well. So we're not really, whereas when we feed pigs or when you and I eat something, we're eating and we're digesting it. In ruminants, when they eat feed, we're feeding the cattle. The microbes in the rumen are then digesting the feed, and then the cattle are really digesting what the microbes have already digested. So it's what we call a symbiotic system. So I had to look up this number. In every milliliter of rumen fluid, that number there, the number of rumen bugs, that is 1 quadrillion. So we're way past millions and billions and trillions. We are talking about 1 quadrillion cells in every milliliter. So there's just a lot of bugs going on there. So like I
Hey
mentioned
Adam,
earlier,
how
yes.
big of is a milliliter? Any ideas?
How
What did
big
you
is a
put in there?
milliliter? That is an eyedropper. So it is when you're if you wear contacts, 1 drop of contact solution is a milliliter. So if you're talking about your cereal spoon, you can probably fit 20 or 30 milliliters into one, cereal spoonful. So not a whole lot of volume. And again, we talk about how many milliliters are in a gallon. I'm not entirely sure even how many milliliters are in a gallon, but if one little drop has 1 quadrillion, that's an ungodly number of microorganisms that are in that 50-gallon vat. So a lot of bugs in there, a lot of microbes, and that's really important because, like I said, we're feeding cattle, whether it's hay, whether it's corn, whether it's wheat, no matter what we're feeding them, they eat that. That is really feeding these microbes in the rumen, and then they're producing what we call volatile fatty acids or VFAs. So y'all don't need to know the specifics of this. That'll if you continue to study agriculture when you get into high school or get into college, you'll learn more about this. But the three main VFAs are acetate, propionate, and butyrate. So basically, all you need to know is the main source of energy for cattle is not necessarily what we feed them, but it's what these microorganisms digest the feed and then what they produce from that. So that's where cattle are getting their protein and getting their energy source is actually from these microbes. So I'll talk about it later, but we need to manage these microbes and keep those microbes happy. And if the microbes are happy, then the cattle are going to be happy and healthy and more efficient from a digestive standpoint. So the second section, I guess, of the ruminant complex, sometimes it gets lumped together with the rumen, but is what we call the reticulum, or it's kind of the honeycomb. And this is the section of the stomach that aids in regurgitation. So when cattle are chewing their cud, that is because the reticulum kind of they chewed their feed initially, swallowed it. It gets worked around in the rumen and digested by those microbes, and then the reticulum will actually shoot that feed stuff back up into their mouth again. And they'll continue chewing and breaking down those feeds until they're a small enough particle size to to pass on to the rest of the digestive tract. So if it, oh, I heard someone speaking up.
I think that was me coughing. I didn't realize I was muted.
Oh, you're fine. I know sometimes I can get on a roll and just kind of keep talking. So if I hear a noise, or if anyone has a question, I'll stop and we can get unmuted or wherever it might be. So like I said, y'all just holler if I'm going too fast or if there's any questions. But this reticulum, not only does it help in regurgitation and chewing their cud, but it also trap foreign objects. So if you've ever heard of hardware disease, where a lot of the time, and we see this in dairy cattle or cattle eating a lot of silage that's been processed by a lot of equipment or machinery. You know, if a cow eats a screw or a big old rock or something like that, that'll get trapped in the reticulum, and it'll keep that foreign object from going further down into the intestines and causing some more problems. So after the rumen and reticulum, we get into the omasum and the abomasum. So the omasum is in the bottom left corner, and it's called, referred to as the mini plies. So it's like a lot of pages in a book, and the main portion of this third section of the rumen digestive system is to really just absorb all the water and dry out that digestive slurry that's been broken down by the rumen. So it's drying it out. And then the fourth stomach component or ruminant stomach component is going to be the abomasum. And that's that bottom right picture. And that's kind of what we call the true stomach. And it's going to function like our stomach as humans or like pigs, where it's going to secrete some digestive enzymes from the liver and the pancreas. And that's going to start chemically breaking down the feeds. So the rumen and the reticulum and the mouth of cattle are physically breaking down feeds and kind of grinding it, and there'll be some absorption across the rumen. That's what all kind of those that fur looking stuff is on the rumen wall. It'll absorb some of those fatty acids, but really those first three components of the rumen are physically breaking down the feeds, and then the fourth component section, that abomasum, is chemically breaking it down. So that's making all those nutrients readily available and absorbable, but for cattle, and that it'll go on. These feeds will pass on to the small intestine and the large intestine, where the rest of those proteins and minerals and vitamins and energy, sources are going to be absorbed and transported throughout the body for animals to use. So if we have a brief, a kind of an understanding of the digestive tract and the ruminant system, I think it really helps when we're planning a nutrition program and understanding why, cattle kind of behave differently than our other livestock. Any questions about the rumen, kind of the physiology and how cattle, the digestive tract's put together, before I move on talking about kind of putting together a nutritional program?
No, I think so. One of the things I was going to bring up, Adam, and I think you hit that on is right. My generation, or what, definitely, we always learned four stomachs, right? And it's not that they have four stomachs; they have one stomach, four compartments. And I think that's a trend that's really changed over the last even 5 to 10 years that they've really pushed. Right? It's one stomach, four compartments, right? And I think that's something that we have to continue to think about. Those that do dairy bowl stuff like that, that's definitely a question that's coming out, and that question's changed over the years.
Oh yeah, and it's it's one of those, it's easy to say four stomachs, but as we're becoming agriculturalists and being trained through 4-H and FFA, and we become more knowledgeable, it's important to kind of be precise with your language. And I always tell folks that less than 2% of the population is directly involved in agriculture, so we're producing food for the rest of the country and really the rest of the world. So people are looking to farmers to, when they have questions about livestock and whatever it is, they're looking at y'all as experts. So you can teach them right, and you can show them what's important, and you can show them that you're learning stuff, and being the smart young agriculturalist that you are. So moving into kind of planning nutritional programs, and this will be important for anybody that has a livestock project. Really, I like to think of it as a puzzle piece, right? So there's a lot of different things that go into planning a program, whether it's the climate and environment, the available resources, feed type and quality, and the desired outputs, right? So we're obviously have different feeds and different temperatures and climates up here in New York than they do in Florida, than they do in Virginia, than they do in California, right? So we're blessed up here in New York to have a lot of cool season grasses, a lot of orchard grass, and a lot of clover, and we can have, one cow-calf pair for 2 to 3 acres. Whereas you get into South Texas and you get into New Mexico, you need 50 to 100 acres of pasture to have enough grass and forage available to feed one cow-calf pair. So, all these pieces come to play together and fit together when planning and, creating a nutritional program. So feed represents the greatest cost of any livestock production system. It's quoted anywhere between 60 and 70% of all expenses. So you can think about, buying a tractor or buying cattle or, whatever, buying fuel for the tractor. All that's really expensive, but when it comes down to it, and when you're really budgeting for all of your livestock enterprises, feed is the greatest portion of that pie, right? The greatest section of the circle that's really going to drive whether or not we're profitable. So with that, if we don't have our feeding right, it's going to be really hard to be profitable. So we really need to know our animals and think ahead, right? So we're going to feed steers differently than we are heifers. The purpose of a steer, because it's been castrated, it can't reproduce. So the only purpose of a steer is to go on and be a part of the beef supply chain. It's going to provide meat and provide beef for consumers to enjoy. Whereas a heifer, she might eventually go into the supply chain, but her heifer's kind of main goal is to, become a cow and get bred and produce more calves. So with that, we need to understand, our class of livestock and how they need to be fed differently. Steers, we want them to get fat because that's, fat is flavor, and fat's going to be how we get our quality grade and that prime, high quality beef that tastes good and worth more money. Whereas heifers, we don't want to get them too fat because they'll have problems breeding, and we'll have some problems with milk production as well. We also need to, think ahead, winter versus summer. We're getting into March and April when the grass is going to slowly start greening up, and we're going to have, a cheap, readily available, high quality feed source in terms of grazing. But that's not going to be around year round, so this is why we make hay during, May and June when we can produce high quality feed in the form of hay or baleage or green chop, silage, whatever it's going to be, because we know that come November when we start, sometimes October, when we start getting that frost, the grass is going to quit growing. So we need to think ahead. And also we need to understand that when it's colder out, animals are going to eat a little more because they need more energy to stay warm. And the converse of that in the summertime when it's really, really hot and we have a steer that's, 12, 1,300 pounds, and we're getting close to county fair time, and that steer's got, a half inch of back fat over his ribs, and he's got that thick leather hide. He's probably not going to want to eat as much, right? It's hot out. He's got that rumen that's working like a fermentation vat and producing all that heat while the microbes are digesting and working. So cattle probably aren't going to eat, fat steers aren't going to eat as much in the summer when it's real hot. So maybe we need to push those steers a little harder in the springtime when it's cooler and we can make them gain a little faster and they're more efficient versus, in the summertime when they're going to slow down, right? So knowing your system, and I always tell folks it's good to work backwards, so being able to understand your goals and work backwards, the more you can plan ahead, the easier it's going to be to plan your work and work your plan and be effective, right? So I've talked a lot about fattening and muscle growth, and really I could spend more time than y'all would want to listen on this chart alone. But basically what this is showing us, and I think we all kind of intuitively know it, this is just kind of makes it a little more sciencey, a little more technical, but young cattle grow differently than older cattle, right? So from birth, calves aren't getting fat, or they shouldn't be getting fat, right? So they're growing, they have a lot of skeletal growth, they get larger and taller and have a lot of bone growth early on, and they have a lot of lean muscle growth as well. And so when we're feeding animals, not all nutrition is utilized equally. So I have this kind of nutritional hierarchy here on the left. So I always use the example of like when we're feeding and finishing steers, right? So remember the number one goal of a steer is to get fat and grow muscle and make some tasty beef. But again, they're not going to be putting on fat equally and they're not going to be growing at the same rate. So early on, nutrition gets prioritized in different segments, right? So I like to think about it as filling different buckets, right? So the first bucket that gets filled when cattle eat is maintenance, right? So that animal is going to stay alive before anything else. It's going to keep the blood flowing. It's going to be breathing. The next bucket that gets filled is growth. So when we have these younger animals that have a lot of bone growth and a lot of muscle growth, that's the next bucket that gets filled. So those nutrients are first going to go to maintenance, then growth. If we have a breeding animal, a cow, milk production and reproductive needs are going to be met next. And very finally, the last bucket that gets filled is fat accumulation, right? So that steer's not going to get finished and put on fat until all those other buckets have been filled. So we look at that point on the graph where we see maturity, that kind of arrow on the flat towards the right side of that chart. It's basically telling us that, as cattle age, they're going to slow down with muscle growth and slow down with bone growth. And that's finally when we get to the fattening stage. And so that's going to help us understand why younger animals might need a little more protein because they're growing, they're prioritizing that bone and muscle growth, whereas older animals probably don't need as much protein because they're not growing, they're not getting taller like our younger animals are. So we can lessen up our protein and focus more on energy on older animals so they can maintain body condition or get fat if they're steers. And I talked about, understanding your animals and, earlier and knowing your animals. I love this picture on the left. Do you think these three animals are going to eat the same, right? This Hereford looking thing on the left, it's not going to eat as much as this, deep red, crossbred looking large frame animal on the right because it's got less stomach space, right? It's got less room and capacity. It's just got a smaller middle, right? So it's going to eat less, and it might be a younger animal, so it might need a little more protein than this animal on the right that might be getting closer to the finishing stage and needing some energy. So again, understanding what animals you have and what your system is, what your feed resources are, what your feed availability is going to be really, really important, right? It's probably not going to be your best interest to, even if you look up a bunch of scientific papers and you find out that soy or sunflower seeds are a really great feed source. Well, if you don't have sunflower seeds around you and you have to ship sunflower seeds in from Kansas, probably doesn't make sense, right? It's probably going to be a real expensive feed to bring in. So it's important to use what's around you and also, have that balance between what's a readily available and cost-effective feed and what's going to be the best feed for the animal that you're feeding. Any questions on kind of nutritional programs and how all this can fit together to and play off each other? I'm not hearing anything, so we'll go into kind of my take-home points, right? So these are the rules of thumb for anybody feeding cattle. So number one is going to be cattle can only utilize nutrients that they consume. So I like to look at this round bale in the top right corner. Look at the hay in the middle of that round bale versus the hay on the outside of it. Do you think the cattle are going to want to eat the hay on the outside of that round bale? That, scraggly, dark,
No.
might be a little moldy. They're probably not going to want that, right? That doesn't look too appetizing to me. So if you have a round bale that's all moldy on the outside and they have to pull off all, 4 or 5 inches of moldy hay before they can get to the good hay in the middle, it doesn't matter that you put hay out there. They might not want to eat it, right? So you have to make sure that feed is readily available to animals. We talked about, cattle scoop stuff with their tongue, and I mentioned earlier, really dried, finely ground corn or feeds, might not be readily available to animals. It doesn't matter if you're putting it out there if they're not eating it, right? I've judged a lot of shows, and one of my favorite questions to ask kind of younger 4-Hers is, what do you feed your animal? And the answer I always get is, 2 scoops of sweet feed, a half a scoop of corn, and maybe a third of a scoop or a half scoop of beet pulp, whatever it might be. And it's important to point out we need to understand what cattle are eating in terms of pounds, right? Your scoop could be different from my scoop, which could be different from your neighbor's scoop, right? So cattle aren't eating when we're doing a precise feed management program. We need to be thinking in terms of pounds and not necessarily scoops, right? We want to be precise and know exactly what we're feeding so we can be consistent with that. And I mentioned earlier, intake can be affected by a lot of things, whether it's the dry matter, the nutrient density, your feeding method, etc. The big thing I always point out is make sure your feed bunk changes with your animals, right? So if you have a really tall feed bunk and you're bringing in some 6-month-old fresh weaned calves and they have to work really hard to reach their neck over that lip of the feed bunk and they can't reach the feed, well, it doesn't matter if you put feed out if they can't reach it, right? Or if they flip over their feed pan and it gets all the feed you put out gets in the mud, right? It's not there for them to eat it, right? So the first thing we got to do is make sure that cattle are actually eating nutrients and we're measuring out the nutrients that they are getting so we can be precise with our feeds. The next thing is cattle consume quantities of nutrients, not concentrations, right? So that's another thing I always hear from folks, I'll ask them, how much feed or what kind of feed are you giving your steer? And they'll say, 16% protein. Or they'll say, Doc, should I be feeding a 12% protein to my heifer or an 18% protein? Well, it doesn't really matter because, again, it depends on how much they're eating, right? So you can feed an animal a half pound of 25% crude protein or 2.5 pounds of 5% crude protein, and that animal is getting the same amount of protein, right? So cattle don't eat percentages, they eat quantities of nutrients, okay? So we need to know, the pounds of protein they're getting. I have a picture in the top right corner of, kind of a bucket that's split into water and feed. Different feeds have different water content, right? So if we're feeding silage, that's about 33% or 1/3% dry matter. That means if we are feeding 10 pounds of silage, really 6 pounds of that is water. So even though they're eating, you're hauling out 10 pounds of feed to an animal, really they only have about 3 pounds of nutrients that they're eating because those other 6 pounds, 6.5 pounds is going to be water that they just kind of pee right out, right? So that's going to be different than if we're feeding soybean meal, than if we're feeding dry beet pulp and wet beet pulp. A lot of different things. We need to understand the dry matter. We need to understand the specific nutrients that cattle need. So I always refer folks to Oklahoma State's nutrient requirements of beef cattle. If you Google that, they have a bunch of different charts just like this that they will break down into, steers or replacement heifers or breeding bulls or breeding cows, and they'll have they'll break it down into 100-pound increments. So whether the animal is, you see here on the left, 600 pounds or 700 pounds, and then what their finishing weight will be. So they have a bunch of different charts that'll show you, depending on what kind of animal you have, heifer, steer, cow, or bull, what size they are, how big they're going to be when they're mature, and how fast you want to grow them, right? So we see in this first column whether you want them to gain 0.5 pound a day or 3 pounds a day, what the specific nutrients they need. So we see on the right, the pounds of protein they need, the amount of energy they need. This is a really, really great resource that if you're younger, you can get, your parents or your uncle, whoever's helping you with your project. They'll might be able to explain this to you a little bit more. But if you're older and kind of more advanced and, getting into your high school years and you've raised a bunch of projects, this is a really great resource for you to see how much specific of each nutrient I need to grow these animals. So that's something I always, pass on folks to this Oklahoma State. It's a great resource. The other rule of thumb, I kind of talked about it earlier. I recommend folks make gradual changes and work backwards, right? So I have a picture of our cartoon rumen microbes up there. If our microbes aren't happy, then our cattle aren't happy and they're going to bloat or get acidotic and real sour stomach or a lot of different things. So we need to make feed changes if we're making them slowly and gradually. So if you want to, you don't wean your calf off a cow and immediately start feeding it 20 pounds of corn right off the bat. It's going to upset its stomach and it's going to really cause some problems. We need to make some gradual changes and understand that cattle are designed to be eat forages like hay and grass and silage, etc. So we need to slowly transition them when we're introducing grains and other concentrates. Otherwise, it can mess up their stomach and mess up those bugs. And lastly, I always recommend folks use feed tag information and laboratory analysis. So if you're growing your own feed, whether you all grow silage or you make your own hay on the farm, if you send off those feeds for laboratory analysis, you'll know exactly how much protein and how much energy and how many vitamins and minerals are in those feeds. And if you know how much is in the feed, when we go back and look at the Oklahoma State, nutrient requirements, we can match our cattle to our goals. And, say we want to have our steer finish at 1,400 pounds and he weighs 800 pounds, and we know how many days we have to do it, we can work backwards and know the average daily gain that we need to meet and the specific nutrients we need to meet with that. And that starts with knowing the specific analysis that you're providing animals through, whether it's, again, laboratory analysis, which can be very cheap and easily done by Dairy One or Cumberland Feeds, or just looking at the feed tag on the feed that we buy at the mill. So with that, I wanted to get into a quick little kind of feed tag exercise, and this will be the last 9 or 10 slides I have. So I just kind of pulled these off the internet. I just Googled cattle feed tags, right? So when we look at this is a 16% high energy beef preconditioner. So the main things I kind of look at, especially for a grower ration, is we're going to look at our crude protein, right? So the very first thing, it guarantees no less than 16% crude protein. We're going to look at our fiber, right? So if we have feeds that are really high in fiber, that takes longer to digest for the ruminant microbes. So feeds like corn and soybean meal and wheat and oats and barley or beet pulp, those different microbes digest different things. So they'll digest that really, really quick. But our hay and our grass and our forages, that takes them a little longer to digest because they have fiber. That's why when you feed animals beet pulp or cottonseed hulls, they fill up and they get a real big middle and a lot of capacity when they're going into the show ring. That's because that feed's sitting in there and it's just taking longer for them to digest. So when we have a high fiber feed, they're probably not going to eat as much because it's take longer to digest. And then we can look at if we're getting more complex our calcium and phosphorus levels. So in general, we want a 2-to-1 ratio. So we see here this meets that, 1% calcium and 0.5% phosphorus on a dry matter basis. That's pretty much what we want. But right off the bat, we're really going to look at our protein and our fiber more than anything. So this is a fairly low fiber feed and a fairly high protein. Whereas we look at this other feed tag, we have our Super Bull and cattle grower. This is going to be lower protein. So this is 13.25%, whereas our last feed tag was 16%. Going to be a lot higher fiber, right? So 20%, whereas our last feed was 10%. So this is probably going to be a little bit of a cheaper feed, right? So when in general, higher protein feeds are going to be more expensive. Higher fiber feeds are going to be less expensive. But one really important thing about this feed, it's what we call a medicated feed. So this is lasalicid. It's what we call an ionophore or something like a rumensin or a Bovatec. This is a medicated feed that helps kind of work on different microbes in the rumen so that good microbes are promoted and less, bad microbes are kind of killed off. And it makes cattle more efficient when they're growing. But with that, we also need to understand that there's some rules and stipulations that kind of come with medicated feeds, right? So we really need to follow our feeding directions and make sure that we're feeding this medicated feed correctly, so we're not giving too much of this feed, or if there's a withdrawal time, we are pulling animals off this feed before they are harvested, and also making sure that the right animal gets the right type of feed. So this lasalicid is extremely, extremely dangerous in horses. So this is very, very toxic in horses. So we want to make sure that if y'all have horses and cattle in the same lot, make sure you're not feeding them a medicated feed, because this could kill your horses at very, very low doses, right? So we need to understand, and when we look at our feed tags, not only is it important to know what we're feeding them from a nutrition standpoint, but also making sure that our other animals or rules kind of, I guess, behind our medicated feeds are being followed correctly. So if we compare these two, like I mentioned earlier, there's an immediate difference in crude protein. So if we go back and we say we looked up at our Oklahoma State, feed requirements, and we figured out that we need to feed our steer 2.2 pounds a day to meet the average daily gain that we want. And if we were to compare these two different feeds, what does it mean to feed 2.2 pounds of our 16% or 2.2 pounds of our Super Bowl and cattle grower? We need to do a little bit of math, right? So how we do that is we take our pounds of feed times our percentage protein or the concentration of protein, and that's how we get the amount of protein fed to our animals. So with that, I'm going to use our 16% high energy preconditioner as an example. We know that we're trying to figure out how many pounds of this feed we need to find. So the first part of our equation we don't know. We know our percent protein, that's 0.16, and we know we want to feed our animal 2.2 pounds of protein. So we take 2.2 divided by 0.16, and we find that we need to feed 13.8 pounds of this 16% high energy beef preconditioner to meet our growing requirements for this, hypothetical animal. And so again, 13.8 pounds, that could be a lot of different types of scoops, depending on what type of scoops that you have. So it's really important, I'm going to harp on this a little bit. We feed pounds, we don't feed scoops, right? So we need to at least weigh our scoops and know how much a scoop weighs so we know how much we need to provide our animals. So, what does this mean in terms of being profitable and feeding, let's see, a 4-H steer? So I did the math on both of these feeds. We'll need 13.8 pounds to meet our protein requirements of the 16%, or we need to feed 16.7 pounds of our Super Bowl grower. If we have 230 days on feed, that's a difference of, what's that? 13 bags of feed if we're feeding one feed versus another. And so if we say, hypothetically, both of these feed bags, both of these different types of feed both cost $20 a bag, that's a difference between a total cost of $1,280 for the high 16% or $1,540 for a Super Bowl and cattle grower. So, again, just working backwards, looking at your county fair date, when you're going to be selling your steer, roughly the weight of your animal when you bought it, and you can work backwards and say, all right, I want this animal to finish at 1,400 pounds or 1,300 pounds, whatever it is. I have this many days to gain this amount of weight. So I know that my animal needs to be gaining this many pounds per day. And I looked up the nutrient requirements of my Oklahoma State, thing that Adam told me to Google. And I know my protein requirements, and that really helps you in your decision making. And it can help you, especially from a 4-H project, make sure your goals are met and make sure your animal is the best it can look and, from a steer perspective, finished and ready for the county fair. So I know I talked about a lot of different things and kind of went over a lot of numbers here at the end. So I have my contact information. As Brian mentioned, I am the state beef cattle specialist through the Cornell Pro Livestock program. So I am based I keep an office at Cornell on campus in Ithaca, but I cover the whole state. So I go where the cattle are. So if anybody has any questions about nutrition or meat science or basically anything beef cattle related, even if it's breeding your heifers or AI versus a bull, anything cattle related, I'd be happy to help where I can. And even if I don't know the answer, I'll find somebody that does. So feel free to email me or call me or give me a text and kind of introduce yourself, let me know who you are and what your question and what your problem is, and I'd be happy to help where I can. So with that, that's kind of the end of my slideshow, and I'll take any questions that anybody has or any comments or whatever you all have on your mind.
All right, guys. So if you've got a question you want to put in the chat box or you want to unmute, raise your hand and we can call on you. If you've got questions for Dr. Murray, we do have a Kahoot at the end also. Bobby. You got to unmute,
Oh,
buddy.
how much time is it from birth to
Harvest or
harvest?
That's a really good question. So the Bobby asked, how much time is it from birth to harvest? That's really kind of going to depend on a lot of different things. So whether you're feeding a heifer or a steer, heifers will finish earlier than steers because they have less muscle and they tend to get fatter quicker. If you have a smaller framed animal, it's going to finish faster than a larger frame animal. If you have a belted Galloway, they are usually smaller animals and will finish more quickly than maybe a Charolais or a Key or a crossbred. Some of those never get finished, right? Sometimes they need to be 16, 1700 pounds before they have that half inch of 12th rib fat thickness that we talk about for what is, a correctly finished animal. But for the most part, we really think about 16 to 18 months, from birth until harvest, in terms of how long it takes in general. Sometimes in the commercial world, when we're talking about feedlots out west, they might feed animals until they're 18 or 20 months old. It kind of depends on a lot of different things. But in general, we talk about, a year and a half old is typically when cattle are ready to be harvested if you're feeding them correctly and providing them enough protein and energy, etc.
Lane or Landon? I'm not sure which one it is. You guys have your hands up. You want to unmute and ask your question? I think it's Carpenter, maybe.
What kind of beef cattle do you have?
I have mainly Angus on my home farm back in Virginia right now. So I have I run a cow calf operation, so I'll breed purebred Angus for replacement bulls and breeding females. I got started actually in the 4-H and in agriculture through a non-ownership beef program when I was 7, 8 years old. So me and my parents actually run a non-ownership program off of our farm back home where we let if we have some heifers that we think are good enough to go back in the herd, we'll bring some 4-Hers out that might not have the expertise or the barn or whatever it might be to keep their own animals. So they'll come out and work ours and show them for a year and get that experience. So I'll dabble in the show world as well, on top of selling replacement heifers and breeding bulls and anything that's not good enough to sell as a breeding stock or not good enough for the show world, we'll feed some out and sell freezer beef as well. So we do a little bit of everything, and it's enough to keep us busy for sure. But we're primarily purebred Angus right now. Every now and then I'll get some Sim Angus crosses in there, and occasionally I'll get a wild hair and breed some crossbreds. But I tend to stay black hided right now.
Any other questions? So I'm gonna share. I've got this one thing I got asked to share. So from and I'm gonna share this. You guys should see it. So it's the Empire of Swine Youth Scholarship, and I'll actually send out an email about this. Addison, I'll come back to your question after I get done sharing. I think you just raised your hand. So at State Fair, they have the Empire Youth Swine Scholarship, where there's different educational contests you can participate in. It's for youth exhibitors to compete in additional shows, swine-based contests, and more. So during the state fair, they have all these other competitions that go along with this, and it's sponsored by New York pork producers. If you've got information, Adam or Ashley McFarland is a contact. Ashley actually asked me to share that today, but I will send it out and I'll put it on Facebook for you guys also and send it to educators. So, Addison, I think you had your hand up.
Adam, how long have you been working for Cornell?
I just started in Cornell in September, so it'd be about 5, 6 months, I guess. I'm sure y'all figured out from how I sound, I'm not from New York originally. I'm from Virginia, so I moved up here middle of September and have been at it ever since. So I see there's a handful of questions here in the chat box. I opened that up now that my presentation's over. I'll try to go down some of these questions here. Joshua asked, is there a substantial difference between the feed value of chopped haylage versus baleage? So that's going to be Obviously, the easy answer is it depends. So every field is going to be different in terms of the nutrient value, whether you have a lot of orchard grass or a lot of clover, what type of forage is growing to produce that haylage or baleage is going to be, going to vary a lot in terms of nutritional value. But I guess I'm interpreting the question as in terms of particle size, right? So chopped haylage versus, unchopped haylage. And typically, especially when we're talking about haylage and baleage, that's a fermented feed. So when we wrap that when we wrap those bales in our white plastic, or whether we're putting in a silo or a bunker or an ag bag, whatever it might be, we're fermenting that feed that's actually having some microbes that are similar to the ones in cattle's rumen. When we're chopping it and blocking oxygen, it starts that fermentation process and it breaks down some of that fiber to make it eat more readily digestible. And when we chop that, it helps with the not only the fermentation process to produce more lactic acid and be a kind of a higher energy feed, but it also helps with intake. So when we have a finer chopped haylage or baleage, whether that's 2 to 4 inches compared to 6 to 8 inches. When it's chopped finer, it's going to ferment more effectively, creating a higher energy feed, and they're going to eat it more quickly. And that finer chopped feed is also going to be digested more quicker. So when it digests faster, that means they can eat more and they can take in more nutrients. So it's a pretty complex question. But so, I mean, if you split a field in half. So let's say it's the same type of grass and forage in there, and you chopped half of it and you didn't chop the other half. I would expect the chopped half of the field to ferment better, have a higher energy content, and also have a higher intake for cattle. So real good question. All of y'all have had great questions so far.
So Janaea has a question. I think Adam's got her hands up.
Go ahead.
What college did you go to?
I went to Virginia Tech for my undergrad, and then Texas A&M for my master's, and then back to Virginia Tech for my PhD. So I did animal science and food science. I got 2 degrees in undergrad. I focused on meat science at Texas A&M, and then I got my PhD in ruminant nutrition, but I still kind of had a meat and beef production background. So I tell everybody I got an affinity for maroon schools. So Virginia Tech is maroon and orange colors. Texas A&M is maroon and white, and Cornell is kind of, a dark red and gray. So I like those red schools.
All right. Any other questions? So we're gonna go ahead. I'm gonna share we'll start our Kahoot. I'm gonna stop recording.